Hopefully at this point, you've read about the observer pattern as well as the more complex PubSub pattern. And you're ready to implement PubSub within our to-do application in order to remove how tightly coupled our components are right now. Now let's review really quick why I say they are tightly coupled. If we look at our app.js, where we converted it to a class-based component to handle the state of our to-do list, we added a to-do item created handler, and this handler takes in a to-do item, and then it handles putting that to-do item into our to-do list and then setting that list as the new list for the state in the component. And when it redraws, the list gets redrawn with the new item added to it. At this point in time, down here in the JSX where our to-do item create component is used, we have a new property added that is the to-do item created event, and we are passing it the to-do item created handler as a property on the props object into our to-do item create. If we go to our to-do item create, we will see that when we hit the submit handler for that form, we are calling this.props.to-do item created event, and we are passing it the new to-do item, which is held in the state. Now, the reason why I say they're tightly coupled is because the app.js has a very specific handler that lives inside of it that has to be passed down to the to-do item created component, and then the to-do item created component has to know about that event handler, and it has to know that it's within its props. It has to call that event handler and pass it the new to-do. This means that these two components, the app component and the to-do items created component, are tightly coupled. In other words, they have to know about each other, and they have to know about the internals of each other in order to function. In other words, the to-do item created component has to know about this event handler that lives inside of our app.js. What this leads us to understand is that when we're dealing with React components, the more we use props for something other than just passing data one directional down into a child component, as we begin to do that, we begin to see, or we should notice, that our components are becoming tightly coupled one to another. Our components shouldn't need to know about each other, and they shouldn't have to call functions inside of each other in order for them to be notified or made aware that some event has happened. The more tightly coupled, or the more properties that are not data related, unidirectional data related, the more this component becomes tightly coupled to other components. And the more we have to use this to-do item created component in different locations within our application, the more of these props we're going to have to add based on where it's being used. And then we have to begin to add code to determine whether or not a particular handler has a handle attached to it, or if we need to use a different one from a different component. And we begin to tightly couple this to-do item created within our application. Right now our application is super simple, so it's only tightly coupled to our app, but we could think that if we moved this, or we began to use this to-do item created inside of maybe our admin page, then we might run into a situation where the admin handles these to-do items or creates to-do items for other users. So let's say that the admin is a project manager, and it's going to add to-do items to each of these users. Once we do that, we now have the to-do item create component being used by an admin rather than the user themselves. And that can create some complexity, and therefore we may have to begin to add some different event handlers inside of our admin page component, and then we would then have to start adding new properties to our to-do item created, or we would be passing different event handlers into this to-do item created event property on our props. No matter how we decide to do it, or no matter what we need to do, whether everything's passing it into this same props field, or if we begin to add other props for different actions, we're going to run into more and more tightly coupled components. And that's the opposite of what we want to have happen. So in the last screencast, we talked about the observable pattern, which is what this is. And then we talked about the PubSub pattern, which creates some separation or some abstraction between components so that they don't know about each other. They don't have to know about each other, and they don't have to pass information to each other, or they don't have to pass event or notification handlers to each other. And the way we fix that is by using a PubSub library. And as we talked about in the last screencast, we have chosen to use the PubSub.js library, which is right here, PubSub.js. And what we're going to do in this video is we are going to implement PubSub, this PubSub library, in order to create some abstraction and remove this tight coupling between our app.js and our to-do item create, and allow them to operate independently but still receive notifications and let people know or notify people when an event happens without needing to have notification handlers pass between the two. And we do that by simply implementing a PubSub library and using that PubSub library in order to let people know that something's happening, and then those who are interested can then react to it without anybody needing to know who is subscribing and who is creating the event. Hopefully, as we implement this, you'll understand better what I'm talking about. If you don't, make sure you go reread about the PubSub pattern. Make sure you really understand it, and then come back and watch this video again. Now, we're going to begin going through the modification of this application to use PubSub instead of the observer pattern, and we're going to decouple these two components. For that, I'm going to go ahead and start the application. So we're going to do an npm start, let it go through its compilation, and get it up and running. And with that, we're going to start the modification of this application. I'm going to describe step by step how we would go about changing this application so that it no longer, let me refresh that really quick. That way it no longer uses the observer pattern, but now uses the PubSub pattern, and we add that abstraction. Now, in a normal application, we're not going to have to, if you're implementing PubSub from scratch, we're not going to have to be removing these notification handlers. But we're going to have to do that in this one right here. So anything where we're modifying or removing, if you're creating your application from scratch, go ahead and ignore that and just focus on the new stuff that I am adding that would be towards the PubSub implementation, or the implementation of the PubSub pattern. So to start out with, I always like to make sure that we get that particular library installed. So I'm going to stop my server. I'm going to do an npm install, and we are going to install the PubSub. So it's PubSub-js, and then we're going to save it as a dependency. So npm install PubSub-js and save. We're going to go ahead and let that install. Once the library is installed in our node modules folder and has been saved to our project, then what we're going to do is I like to make sure that when I implement a PubSub library, that I keep all of the subscriptions, or all of the names of the subscriptions, in one location, and it becomes your common library for any notifications that this application has that different components can subscribe to in order to find out if an event has occurred. Now, this being a pretty simple application, we're really only going to have one subscription that components can subscribe to. But we could, as the application gets more complex and we implement more abilities in this application, or more functionality, we may end up with more subscriptions that components can subscribe to find out when an event happens and receive any data as a result of that event happening. So for that, inside of our source folder, we're going to go ahead and create a new folder, and that new folder is going to be lib, which stands for library. And inside of the library is where we are going to start putting all code that is common to all components. Again, all code that is common to all components. And being that our publish subscribe pattern and all of our subscriptions should be available to all components, we're going to go ahead and create within that lib folder a new file, and we are going to call it subscriptions.js. And it is going to be a new module that will hold all of our subscriptions that any of our components can subscribe to. Now, to understand this, subscriptions are really just a string that is unique that we use when we publish to a subscription that an event has happened, and when we subscribe to an event to be notified when it happens. So it's really just a string. It's a unique key that we use when we start using the PubSub library in our components. So just keep that in mind. So really what we're going to do is we're just going to create a bunch of constants that have a very unique string to them. So let's do export const, and then we're going to call this the to-do item created subscription. And of course, it needs to be a string because we're going to be using it all the time. And we're just going to go ahead and copy that key in there. And this becomes the key for this particular event, the to-do item created event. And so whenever a component actually publishes an event to this subscription, it's going to use this key. And any component that is subscribing to this event is going to use this key. And that from now on allows the PubSub to make sure that anybody who's saying something happened inside of this subscription will use this key. And then anybody who wants to know that an event happened will use this key. That was kind of redundant, but redundant repetition helps. All right, so this is really our only subscription within this module. So we'll go ahead and close that. Now we need to go ahead and make some modifications to our to-do item create component. And we're going to go ahead and import the PubSub library first, since we know this component is going to want to publish that a new to-do item has been created. So we're going to go ahead and import, and we're going to import PubSub from, and then it is going to be PubSub.js is the library we're pulling it from. So now we have access to PubSub in order to publish that a new to-do item was created. And now we need to make sure we get the right subscription key so that we're using the right subscription channel to publish this event. So let's go ahead and import. And since we're only subscribing to that one subscription, or we're only going to publish to that one subscription, we're going to pull in the to-do. I think I already copied it in my copy. There it is. So to-do item created. So that's the subscription name we want. And from, and then we're going to go ahead and pull that in from our lib. So we are currently down inside of components, inside of the to-do item create. So we need to go up 2 directories, go to our lib folder, and then we need to pull in our subscriptions module. Great. Now we have our key for the very important subscription that we want to publish to. And then our app.js will subscribe to that same one, and we'll get to that in a minute. So now, inside of our to-do item, we need to go down here to our submit handler. And inside of our submit handler, because we're no longer going to be passing in a notification handler in order to uncouple the app from the to-do item, we're going to go ahead and delete that. I'm just going to comment it out right now, but you would just normally delete that line because we're not going to use it anymore. And then in its place, we're going to use the PubSub library. So we're going to say PubSub.publish. Now remember, we're going to publish to this subscription key right here. We're going to publish to it because we're trying to let everybody who cares know that we have an event that happened on this subscription channel, and we are going to pass back this .state, just like we did when we called the notification handler, because this represents our new to-do item. So really, that's all we need to change inside of our submit handler. So we're no longer using our to-do item notifier, our to-do item created notification handler that comes from our app.js, because we are now just going to publish directly to the global PubSub and let anybody know who subscribes to it. So right now we're publishing to it, and our app is going to subscribe to it to be notified when a new to-do is created. So now that we've got that implemented, I'm going to go ahead and delete that so we're no longer dependent on it. And now that we've got this to-do item and this .state being published to this particular channel in our PubSub, now we need to go ahead and we need to make sure that in our application, we remove the to-do item created event property from our to-do item create, and we no longer pass the to-do item handler to this component because this component no longer accepts it. So we'll go ahead and delete that. And because it no longer accepts it in the props, because we're not using it down here in our handler, we're using a PubSub to announce that, we're no longer bound to this app, and the app is no longer bound to the to-do item create. So we've just separated them. They are now decoupled, but our app is not yet set up to subscribe to that event. So we need to do exactly what we did on our other one, is we need to import our PubSub so that it can begin using it. So PubSub from, and then PubSub.js. And then we need to do the exact same thing we did with the to-do item create, is we need to import, and we are going to be importing the to-do item created subscription key from, and then we are now in the root of the application, so we just need to stay in the same directory, go to our lib, and then pull in our subscriptions. And now we have this key for the subscription or the channel that we're going to use to subscribe to. Again, the one creating the event, it publishes to that channel, and the one that is accepting the event or wants to know about the event happening will subscribe to it. But they both need to use the same channel key for their publishing and for their subscribing. So now we've got PubSub and we've got our to-do item created key for that channel. And now, since we've removed that, we've imported those, now we're ready to go ahead and set up our subscription to it. So inside of our constructor down here, after our handler has been bound to our component, we're then going to use this handler inside of our PubSub. So we're going to go ahead and add that now. So we're going to do similar to what we did in the other one, PubSub, but instead of doing the publishing, we're going to subscribe to that channel. So it's going to be PubSub subscribe. And of course, we are subscribing to the to-do item created channel. And when we get notified that an event happens on this channel, we're going to want our this.todoItemCreated handler to be the one that's called. So now, instead of passing this to our component through props and tightly coupling these two together, we are now loosely coupling them in that they no longer have to know about each other anymore. Now, whenever a event gets put on this channel or published to the channel by the to-do item create, this handler is going to be called immediately by PubSub to let this component know that something happened somewhere in the application and it has to do with a new item being created, and the app really wants to know about that because it is responsible for updating the to-do list. So with this PubSub set up, let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So let's do an npm start. Let it compile. And then we're going to go to our browser. Still compiling. Server starting. Come on. Come on, React. There we go. All right, everything's good. Let's refresh. Looks like we are locked up. So let's copy that, close this window, open up a new window, put that in there. And here we go. Open up our JavaScript console down here. Let's refresh this really quick. Looks like we have some breakpoints. I'm going to go ahead and undo our breakpoints. Click play. All right. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at this then. Make sure all my breakpoints are off. All right. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and type something in. Type something in. Click submit. And we've got ourselves an error. And it says cannot read property state of undefined. And here we're doing the submit handler. And we're doing a publish. And we're saying this.state. It looks like we have a syntax error right there because we have ourselves an awesome period instead of a comma. So let's go back to our code. Let's go back to our app where we are subscribing. We've got a comma there. And here we've got a period instead of a comma. Let's let it refresh. Now let's try it again. Put some data in there, put some data in there, click submit. Cannot read property ID on a string to do item created. And we see that that is right here on the to do item created handler inside of our app. So if we come into our app and we look at our to do item created handler, well, we're pulling in a to do like we did before. Well, let's see what's happened. Let's go ahead and in our app.js, let's put a breakpoint right inside of our to-do item created handler. So we'll put a breakpoint right here. Let's refresh the page. Right. Let's try it again. Let's click submit. Let's look at our to-do item. If you notice, it says to-do item created. It's not our to-do anymore. And that's why we're getting an error. So if we click play, we get that awesome error. And that is because when we are using PubSub, when an event handler gets called, if we go back to our documentation here, the handlers that we are passing in as the subscription handler, you'll notice that it takes in a message and then the data. And the message is usually the name of the channel if we don't provide a message ourselves. So if we don't provide two parameters when we call the actual event, when our publish happens, then it's going to go ahead and set it to the name of the event. So we need to make sure that our handler follows this pattern of message and data. So let's go back to our code, and we just need to add message right here. So message, comma, and then to do. And we're really worried about this to do, not the message. So let's save that. Let's go back to our code. Refresh our app. Now let's try this again. Type something in, click submit. And we can see that it was added. It was added to our to-do list. Refresh. No errors. Everything looks good. Our submit still works. Our notification handler is still responding because it is being notified by PubSub. And then, of course, the application gets re-rendered. And when it re-renders, because the list has a new item and we used set state, the application will automatically re-render. Now, as of right now, we haven't set up that we clear these right here after a submit. So we could do that just to make it a little bit nicer. So let's go ahead and in our to do item created, when our submit handler publishes that this all happens and this .set state is then passed as the object, then we can go ahead and do this .set state. And then let's set back our name to an empty string, and let's set our description to an empty string. And let's see what happens. Go back to our code, type something in, click submit. Of course, we had our breakpoint there. Let's undo our breakpoint, click play. We can see that the item was added right here. We didn't have a reset on those values. So let's submit again. working. Let's delete that, delete that. Submit. Got a new one in there. Our fields are still not being reset, even though the default values are set to state.name and state.description. We did this.setState. We're setting the name and the description. Well, we should have those fields being cleared. But they are not being cleared in our submit handler. So maybe we can go ahead and use our refs to do that. So we'll still do the set state, but let's use our refs to do that. So let's say this, this dot, we called this name input and description input. So let's do this dot name input dot current dot value equals an empty string. This dot description input dot current dot value equals that. Refresh. Now let's see what happens. Let's try this. Those, submit. And now they are cleared. All right. And if we look at our console, all the events have fired. So everything's working the way it did before with the added functionality that we now cleared the fields using the references to those. And then we set our state back to empty in preparation for this submit button to set the state again, or to pull the state from the onChange events as they modify the state for each of these. We've cleared them. And the cool thing is our components are no longer tightly coupled because we are not passing a notification handler into our to-do item create via props. We are using a PubSub library for global event notification so that we can publish to those channels and subscribe to those channels. If you don't quite understand this, make sure you rewatch the video. Make sure you go read about the PubSub pattern, go read the documentation on PubSub.js, and talk to an instructor or a tutor if you're still stuck.